Welcome to Yourself at Work with Kristen and Daryl. Our guest today is Christina Maslach, a professor of psychology emeritus at UC Berkeley and the pioneer of the research field of organizational burnout. She created the Maslach Burnout Inventory, the most widely used instrument for measuring burnout, and has written numerous articles and books, most recently, The Burnout Challenge. We discuss the relationship between burnout and mental illnesses such as depression and anxiety, and that burnout is not an individual problem, but the result of a mismatch between the worker and the workplace, and actions leaders can take to reduce burnout and increase engagement in their workforce. So here's our conversation with Christina. So Christina Maslach, welcome to Yourself at Work. You have been such a pioneer and thought leader in the field of organizational burnout, and we are absolutely thrilled to have you with us today to discuss this really important and timely topic of burnout in organizations.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation.
Absolutely. And so to start out, just to kind of level set and ground us, what is the definition of burnout? I think it's a phrase that gets used really loosely. And how would you actually define burnout?
Yeah, it's a good point because it's such a term that's so popular and has such vivid imagery that we see people using it for all kinds of things. And so sometimes we've really got a Tower of Babel problem here, in terms of, we're not on the same page in how we're using it. Although I think in general, people use it to mean something that's not working. It's not good, it's bad rather than good, so that kind of thing. But the term for, in terms of describing what's going on with you at the job was something that I stumbled on by accident back in the early 70s when I was talking with people, interviewing them for another related but different project. I didn't know anything about job burnout, but it was, as I was interviewing them, they would then say, "Can I tell you some more things about it? Beyond your question, some other thing?" Sure. And that was when I began to hear from them what eventually people began to call burnout. And at first, people didn't necessarily have a way to talk about it other than something is not going right with me, my job, etc. And I then happened by chance to talk to someone who had been a poverty lawyer, legal services lawyer, and we had just met and we started chatting about what we're doing, and I mentioned some of the things that I was hearing in my interviews, and she said, "Oh my gosh, I don't know what you call it, but in legal services we talk about that as burnout." I thought, interesting. And when I then began to end the interviews with saying, "So how do you talk about it? Do you use a term, whatever?" And well, no, and I suggest some psychological concepts. Well, no. And then finally say, "What about burnout?" Yes, that's it. That captures it.
Yeah, and I love the sort of story there of you're not explicitly looking to study that. You're talking with people, you're asking about their experience, and you're sort of seeing it emerge as an important area to study.
What was really striking to me was I would be talking to people and they'd be getting angry and upset about what had happened to them. Some people would get really teary-eyed and cry as they were describing certain kinds of things. And I was thinking, whoa, this is a powerful thing that's happening here. People aren't talking about it in a very disengaged way. It really has hit them in an important way, and they're willing to talk about it. In fact, they want to talk about it and have asked me, "Do you mind if I tell you more?" But it just sort of struck me there's something important going on here, and I don't know what it is, but I need to find out more. And that really kind of got me going on doing the research. It picked up later on after I got tenure. In fact, I could be a little bit more risky in doing other kind of research than a brand new thing on a phenomenon that people said, "Oh, that's pop psychology. That's not really, there's not many people who are going to experience that." Well, no, we've now discovered that there's a real phenomenon going on there. And the fact that in 2019, the World Health Organization officially recognized it as a legitimate occupational phenomenon that can have health consequences, but is not itself a medical condition. It's not a mental illness. It's not a physical illness. And basically what it is a response to stressors. So it is a stress response. And the thing about that that's important is that a stress response is a normal part of human functioning. And when people ask, well, why isn't it given a label and a number, in the manual as a different, a disease and a mental illness? It's because people don't think you should be pathologizing a stress response. I mean, that's normal. Thank God we have stress responses when we have challenges and threats and, and all of these kind of things. So the problem is not that it's a response to stressors, it's how we deal with that, cope with it, but also, and this is really the argument I want to make, is that it's not enough just to help people cope with the stressors. You want to change the stressors, because otherwise it's saying, sorry, you just have to deal with it. Job is what it is, stressful, suck it up, kind of thing. And actually, it's more of a management issue, because if we have chronic, and this is the important thing, chronic job stressors, which means they're there most of the time, they don't go away. It's much harder for people to cope with chronic stressors than with occasional acute, temporary over with, kind of stressors. So chronic is part of it. But as World Health pointed out, these are chronic job stressors that have not been successfully managed. And there's an optimistic note there. They could be successfully managed. The assumption is one could do something about this and provide a better, safer, healthier work environment where people can really thrive and grow and do well and be proud of their work rather than get beaten down by it. So ultimately, we need to focus on not just the effect, which is, oh my gosh, people are experiencing burnout, which contains the stress response of exhaustion, but also the negative response to the job. Cynical, hostile, it's not a good place, it's not working well, take this job and shove it, kind of, country western song, title, or, um, and then a negative response to oneself. What's wrong with me? Why? Maybe I made a mistake. I shouldn't be doing this. Why can't I handle it? So when you get those three together, which is the exhaustion of stress, but it goes beyond that to be this negative reaction to the job, negative reaction to oneself. That's the full kind of burnout picture there. We see people who are showing one of those three dimensions sometimes, and it might be it's developing, or they're recovering from it or something. So often people who are exhausted, which is the stress response again, that in and of itself is not burnout. It's stress for sure. But if you still love your job and you still feel good about the work you're doing, even though you're exhausted, tired, got to get up again this morning, you're overextended. And there are certainly issues about how can you cope, or how can we change the job to make it less demanding. But it's not the full burnout. And for me, more of the hallmark of burnout is really not so much the stress, but the negative, cynical attitude that comes, towards the job. And what we find there is that when people begin to experience that, they really switch from trying to do their very best to doing the bare minimum. What do you have to do to get out of here, still get your paycheck, and but bare minimum is not always going to be the best in terms of teaching a student or serving a customer well, or taking care of a patient, et cetera. I mean, there's all kinds of things that could be happening there. And we see burnout associated with drops in productivity, in the quality of the work. One of the early studies done by colleagues showed that nurses in an ICU were rated by their patients, and the ones who were more nurses who were experiencing greater burnout were the ones that patients said aren't doing a good job. This is not somebody that I want having taking care of me. So they were sort of recognizing what was happening there.
How does it relate to depression?
It can lead to depression. Some people have argued that, burnout is just depression. And that would say, well, wow, we've got a lot of people who need therapy and individual treatment for this, and we would argue on the data that it's not the same as depression, and psychiatrists that I've consulted with agree as well. Can it be a health outcome of burnout? Yes. Just like, more cardiovascular problems, greater risk of heart attacks can also be an outcome. We know it's an outcome of stress. If your body's not recovering well, then you are going to be at greater risk for certain kind of health problems. And I think both physical and mental. So depression can be correlated, can be an outcome, but to somehow say, oh no, burnout is a mental illness actually has the unfortunate impact of pointing the finger of blame at the person. What is wrong with you? There's still a stigma about mental, problems and difficulties that people have. But it essentially says it's within you. It's some problem with you in terms of how you're living, choices you're making, what you're doing, whatever. Can you get treatment for it? Can you get therapy and help? Maybe, different places are probably better at referring people to resources like that or not. But it's still framing it as this thing is happening to you. It must be about you. It's your responsibility. Pick yourself up by your bootstraps, et cetera, et cetera. And it ignores, by looking just at those effects, it ignores the causes. Why did this happen? Not who is burning out, but why are they burning out? And the why question is sort of saying, okay, there must be something going on that leads people to experience burnout, or, is going to lead to depression down the road or whatever. Once we look at that, then we need to sort of say, okay, what could we do about the stressors? How can we reduce them, make them less frequent, reduce the impact? Realize that we have to redesign the job so that people who have to do things that are highly stressful and important and have to be done need some accommodation in terms of recovery and getting back up and, ready to go again the next day, at full strength. So the book, The Burnout Challenge, is really about summarizing how we need to look at the workplace, and we need to look at it in a way that says, where are those chronic job stressors, those pebbles in the shoe? Where are they coming from? And we've identified at least 6 areas and devote a chapter to each, of sort of saying, here's what's going on in terms of people and their relationship with their job. Is there a good fit or match? Or is there, not perfect necessarily, but I mean, a good, fit or match between people and what they're doing and where they are? Or is there a mismatch that is really causing and leading to the risk of burnout, in the future, rather than greater engagement with work? So that's more of a prevention approach. And I think that the World Health Organization recognition of it as an occupational phenomenon, and very strongly they said it is not a medical condition. This is World Health saying that, American Psychiatric Association saying that. It's not a health condition. It can have health outcomes, but the way people think about it very commonly is as a health condition. And you get diagnosed and you have symptoms and you get sent to a doctor, for treatment with, drugs, or, take off from work and then, do some other kind of therapy or something. But it's fixing the person. It frames it in a way that I think is not true to actually what's causing the problem. And until we really come to grips with how do we begin to also modify the workplace, not in huge, incredibly $billion, numbers, but in little things. The pebbles in the shoe is a great metaphor because it's in terms of the scale.
I mean, this is fascinating. It's something that I've been trying to figure out for a long time. In 2005, 6, 7-ish, I had sort of this personally a flow of, extreme kind of, I don't know, workaholism into exhaustion, which later led to an anxiety disorder, which later led to a major depression diagnosis. And in there, there were these stages that clearly were happening to me. And in there, people often use the burnout term. And somewhere in there, I'm sure it probably was true. and then
Yeah.
later led to really mental illness. And
Yeah.
it's something I've been trying to figure out for a long time of like, what actually was that? And I think that the way that you describe it,
Mhm.
really, it makes a lot of sense to me, and separating especially the kind of organizational triggers from what then later was, a medical situation,
Right.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
Down the road,
that really
it
resonates.
could happen.
Yeah,
Yeah. No, I'm okay. So your own experience then is a way in which you can sort of flesh that out and really give more context to what that means. And it's interesting because I've often heard the kind of story you just told from different people who, I mean, for example, would say, I used to be the one who would always raise his hand when they said, could anybody do this extra da
yeah,
da da da, come in on your time off and do da 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 da? And I would say, yeah, because I thought that's the way to success. And
yeah,
one day I couldn't do anything anymore. I just fell apart. I
yeah,
just, kind of thing. And so there's also, I think, an interesting look at, and the two of you may be able to really say more about this in some way from your own experience, is what has developed over recent years, even before pandemic, hustle culture, the 996 thing that we see in China, even the karoshi, death from overwork in Japan. I mean, we're seeing it in different forms, whatever, but this idea that what to be successful is you have to go overboard, more hours, more time. If you're not working, you're not doing enough, that kind of thing. And I know that a lot of people have said that it's a culture of fear.
Mhm.
You can't say no, because if you say no, what's going to happen? Maybe you lose your job. Maybe you won't get a promotion. Maybe, whatever. Even if it's a request that you're thinking is, wait a minute, you're asking me to come in on my time off to do work instead of resting, being with my family or friends or, whatever. And maybe not even getting paid or, what, but there's a sense of there will be bad things if you don't, go 150%, kind of thing.
One of the things I really have enjoyed and benefited from in your research is you talk a lot about the relationship between well-being and productivity and between burnout and efficacy. And
Mm-hmm.
I think maybe you could speak to this a little bit. I think so often there's this false dichotomy between, as an organization, either we're going to be really productive, which means work as much as possible and kind of push, 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 or we're going to take care of our team, which means people are going to be happy and balanced, but maybe we'll get less done. It's sort of presented as an either or and a false dichotomy.
Mm.
And everything that you have talked about and that you found in your research is that
Yeah.
it goes together, right?
It,
Like that when people are burned out, not only is it bad for them emotionally and personally, it's bad for their work. They're cynical, they're less effective. The nurses are less well liked by their patients.
right.
And so would love for you to just kind of comment on, like, if you have thoughts on, like, where did that misperception come from, that this is an
Oh
either or?
gosh.
Because the research shows it's one and the same.
Yeah. It's a good question. I don't know where that came from, but it's it's certainly part of earlier culture that somehow this notion that you just have to work harder. If you work harder and you
Mm-hmm.
put in more hours and you sort of develop that whole thing of you do work more, etc., it's kind of like a logic of, oh, well, then there will be more done and it'll be better, kind of thing. And not realizing that and assuming then you can just sort of keep upping the ante. Okay, so you need to produce 6 widgets, and now, well, if you can do 6, how about 7, how about 8, kind of thing. And just uh, what we're finding is, and it's not news really, it's we've known from stress research for a long, long, long time that there are limits to human beings in terms of how they can work, think, do things. And if they're pushed beyond sort of boundaries that they have or can, there will be negative effects. And you need to allow for and provide opportunities for recovery. I mean, any good athlete knows this, that you train and you to go as fast as you possibly can. Let's say you're a runner, okay, and you go all out and so forth, and then the race is over and you have to stop You have to rest, you have to recover before you can get back up to the, ready to run the next one. And so this stress recovery is part of the whole process of stress response for human beings, that, it only works if you have the recovery. I mean, otherwise you're going to be exhausted, can't begin the next race, kind of thing, if you didn't have that. So that the notion of the recovery, and ways in which people do that is really important. Now, it used to be, I think, more recognized implicitly that you work 8 hours a day, okay, the 9 to 5 sort of thing, and then you go home and you have 8 hours of sleep, and you've got a whole bunch of family, friend time, personal hobby time, leisure, whatever you want to call it. It's also the time when you do your errands and go grocery shopping and, pay the bills and stuff like that. But it's personal time. And personal time and sleep, those two other sort of 8-hour, presumably, chunks of your 24-hour day, are part of the recovery. And that's why you need to get a lot of sleep and rest. And you need to do other things so that you're enjoying the rest of your life and developing whatever relationships, et cetera, et cetera. As the workplace and linked things like commuting take up more and more time, it's taking time away from either sleep and or personal life, so that more and more of it is going into the work bucket. It's taking away more and more of time from the rest of a normal recovery cycle, which is the sleep and the personal time. And at some point, people are not going to be able to function well. And that's why they're going to have health problems. That's why they're going to have productivity problems. They're going to be too tired. They're going to miss things. They're going to make errors. And there's data that other people have done that have shown that. They're not going to do as good a job even when they're trying to. So it does have an impact on the quality of what's going on in the workplace. They may take more sick days. They're out. They're absent. Mental health days. That kind of. They're trying to get some time off or some more time back to the recovery, and that's not happening. So, I think what I hear a lot from people is that they're exhausted. They're trying whatever they can do to get some extra time back into their life from this other kind of culture that just says if you do more, it's going to be better.
Yeah, I think one thing where large organizations really struggle, and leaders of large organizations would probably say something like, well, I can't measure how much sleep my employees are getting. I can't measure blah, blah, blah. And so, but what I can measure perhaps is how many hours are they at work? How many lines of code did they write? These sort of really not great proxies for productivity.
Mm-hmm.
And kind of, and I think this is where some of the false dichotomy that we were talking about of it's either productivity or it's well-being. And I think big company leaders, and probably even small company leaders, but I think it's really hard to measure, I've got 100,000 employees. What the heck what all I can measure is, these very kind of broad stroke sort of things. And
Mm-hmm.
I think that even companies where the leaders may genuinely care about this as an issue, I think there is also this culture of, well, if we can't measure it, like if I want to put a program in place of, okay, I want a healthier workforce, or I want to reduce the burnout of my organization or things like that. But wow, I've got 100,000 employees. How am I going to measure some of these things like quality of rest? Or how am I going to measure, did this well-being program lead to increase in productivity? And I think sometimes it leads big organization leaders to sort of throw their hands up and say, well, I guess, and I think that's to your point before, where it comes into, well, I guess then it's just a personal problem, which is wrong.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, it's a personal problem, and if I can add a little point to that, because I hear this a lot, is that I will hear some of these leaders say, and look, people have other stressors in their life. We're not involved in their personal life. We can't, so if they're bringing problems to work, I mean, that's not something we can do anything about. But it keeps saying, isn't it, there's certain personality types? Aren't there things that people have stress at home and that's their issue? It's your problem. It's not ours,
Yeah.
But in fact, our problem, I think, in the workplace is you have the responsibility, I think, to create a healthy environment in which people come in to do whatever the work is that goes on there, and to make sure that they have the training, the equipment, the processes, whatever, to do the job, not just the physical job, but the kinds of things that for us, the fit is more about the social psychological thing, the key, what makes people tick. It's not just what can they do, in terms of doing code or something like that, but what makes them motivated, what makes them be careful so they're not going to make errors and deliver really better work, what makes them willing to help out and make sure that the team is doing good, and if somebody is having trouble, they'll jump in to try and help, make it happen. Those are all basic social psychological needs that every person has, just like they all have a stress response to threats or challenges. And an environment that not only asks you to do work, but recognizes when you do it well, provides you with the support to get it done, allows you some control to, course correct or do things when you see something that needs to be fixed, take pride in the work that you're doing, feel good about, that you're contributing, all of that kind of stuff. That's really more the fit that we're talking about. And so the environment, how does it support people to do the job well and to feel good about what they're doing and continue to do that sort of thing? The pandemic really opened the door, I think, or let's put it this way, I think it actually sort of threw into the dust the notion that the job is what it is, and you just have to keep up with it. We learned that the job can be different. The job can be done differently. We had to do it differently. It's not that all the things we did differently worked. There were mistakes, things that didn't work well, but we can learn from that. What might have been a better way to go? Mm-hmm. And it at least says, I always use as an example that phrase, if you can't take the heat, get out of the kitchen, which again is saying it's your fault if you can't do the job. And the other what the saying is, you know what, you can turn down the heat in the kitchen. You can put in better ventilation and actually create a better environment for people to cook and serve and, wash up and all the rest of it. So the pandemic showed it's possible, and we need to get better at designing those kind of environments, or figuring out how could we make some modifications, at least in the direction of doing that better. So the solutions, I think, are still locked into that other notion of the job is what it is, and we call the shots, and you just have to accommodate to it. And what people are seeing now is people are saying, sorry, I'm not coming in. I'm leaving the job. I'm quiet quitting, loud quitting. I'm, you're going to have to hire other people. And the solutions that are often come up, I mean, people call about, okay, we're just going to maybe shut down the company for a week, just take a sabbatical for a week. Everybody has a rest and so forth, and then we'll come back and burnout will be gone, right? And I'll say, if you have the same chronic stressors, no, you're coming back to the same old, you're going to have the same problem. So, it's not that having a rest, having a break is not a good thing. It can be, but it doesn't prevent the problem from reappearing, because you're really not addressing the actual sources and causes of the problem. And that, for a lot of people, it's just like, can't kind of get it into their head that might be something. This is an opportunity. I mean, pandemic forced us to try and think of different alternatives. Mm-hmm. So, let's keep going and think about more alternatives, not dictated by the pandemic, but ones that we could create, we could experiment with, we could try and figure out what would be a better way. And by talking to the people doing the work, what would be better ways to support them, train them, reinforce what they're doing in positive ways. There was another thing I saw recently, which jibes with a lot of what we've heard in interviews, and that is some survey that showed that leadership at many levels said they understood what their employees were going through and how exhausted they were and whatever. And the employees were saying, you don't understand. And so there's a gap there. And a lot of that has to do with communication and that kind of culture. And I'm not sure of all the changes we might do or conceive of or something like that. But I will say that the thing that we used to talk about as walk-around leadership years ago, which meant that leaders of whatever, the supervisors, the managers, the people in the C-suite, would take time regularly to be out in all the different units on the floor, whatever, to see how things were going and check in with people and find out. And every time we have somebody who does that as a way, we say, get a better sense of what is happening with your employees, and, et cetera, on these pebbles on the shoe and in the shoe and so forth. It's usually, oh my God, wow, what I didn't know, or I heard something, or people came up with this great idea, and it's the message from a lot of the hustle culture is that there's just this increasing gap between people who are leading and people who are following, and the people who are following or being managed or whatever, overseen, are not having much input into or feedback into what could be even better for us, or we could achieve our goals, in ways that are, better. When that happens, that's also a way in which employees can signal that they want to be a part of the solution. They don't want to be the problem. And they're willing to work with, ideas and stuff, but be taken seriously and get the message, we care about your well-being and doing the work. And yes, let's get together on this. So managers, certainly first-line managers, are in the sweet spot of being able to know what's going on and to work with people on a regular basis and just say, okay, so how can we make it a little bit better around here for everybody, rather than trying to find out who's burned out and what do we do about that person. There was a Gallup poll last year, I think, which showed that according to their polling worldwide, that only about 20% of workers reported that they were engaged with their work. Gallup does a lot of stuff on engagement, which is sort of the opposite of burnout. And 20% means 80% are less than engaged, so some are burned out, some are overextended, some are disengaged, some are feeling ineffective, but if you could make some changes to improve the work environment and the communication, on how do we get rid of some of these pebbles in the shoe, deal with some of these chronic job stressors. I mean, a rising tide lifts all boats, and it doesn't, you got 80% who are less than, thrilled. So for me, focusing on burnout is only helpful if we get away from focusing on blaming people for burnout and actually it leads us to ask a different question, not who is burned out, why, but also how can we just make the place a little bit better.
So one of the things I was curious about is because the Gallup study reminded me, I saw another Gallup study showing that like the rate of burnout amongst frontline managers was actually like the highest rate of burnout in the organization.
Yeah.
And then a lot of times it's frontline managers that we're asking to help with this. And so I would love your thoughts, like when you start thinking of like a large organization, like say 100,000 people in an organization, maybe there's 10,000 managers. It's really like a scaled organization. How do you think the responsibility varies by leadership level? Like kind of like what do you think would be the responsibility of, say, like the top executive C-suite versus the frontline manager versus maybe a vice president in the middle? Like what does each person kind of own in terms of creating that environment?
Well, I think one of the things is to figure out how to get more of that collaborative conversation going, not just top down, but bottom up, sideways. I don't care, but better ways in which we find avenues to have, how could we do a better job here? What would be needed in terms of the work conditions that might improve how well we do the job? Do we get the support we need, et cetera? And so that's one, kind of thing, because we really need more input from people who actually have to carry out whatever somebody else says. And that would be also including things like how leaders at upper levels, and it could be different kinds, but the ones working with the managers, particularly the first line managers, I think, because as I said, they're in a sweet spot, but they are also, just like everybody else, they are subject to burnout for sure, because they're getting it from more than one side, kind of thing. But they could be an absolutely valuable resource in getting things done and changed or improved. And so part of it is, what is it that they need in order, to do their job better? Sometimes what I find is that they are trained to do things that actually aren't working that well. So they think they're doing their job well, but it's not helping them actually do it. So, and I've often run into people saying, well, how do you talk about changing the workplace or making some of the tasks better? And I say, it's the pebbles in the shoe. That's the scale. It's not big billion-dollar, change healthcare in the 21st century or something. But how about, what do you have, weekly meetings? Do you have monthly meetings? I mean, do you have some times where you could get together, or you make a special thing that, we're getting input from people about the things that aren't working well, and let's take a few of these and sort of figure out what we could do it and customize it to our team. Because it may be that what works for us in pediatrics is not what's going to work for everybody else in the hospital. That's fine, as long as this helps us, given the clientele that we're working with. And to keep working at it until we get something better and people feel good about. So that commitment kind of thing. So I think that's part of it. But I think it may be, in some cases, trying to recognize that there are people who are in positions where they could be part of the solution, and they may need permission to do that, in the sense of saying, we actually would like you to do this, as opposed to, we're giving you, not permission, but we're telling you, you have to do X and Y. And, you don't want it to sound like, oh, and here's one more thing to put on your plate, without taking anything else off. But, kind of working out, how could we better support your work with your unit, your team, your whatever, to, really convey to the group, we care about people's well-being here. We're really trying to figure out on our side, in terms of the organization, the company, this team, whatever, can we make things better in terms of the job conditions that will, help get rid of these, or reduce these chronic stressors, and we'll work on it together. We need your input as to what you need, and so forth. We can't promise the world, but let's try and figure out something that will make a difference. And that's why in our book we tried to put in a lot of examples that, again, were successful at doing that, but showing that they're more the small stuff, the everyday chronic stuff. It's not the big sexy stuff necessarily, but the pebbles in the shoe is that metaphor that I think kind of gets across. That's where we're looking at, what is the thing, because we know those chronic job stressors are the cause. How can we begin to do it? And figuring out ways in which we can routinely get back to that agenda item. So it's something we're always it's part of how we do business. It's not going to be a one-time, one shot. We're going to do a workshop and then everybody will know, and then we'll be fine and burnout's over. No, that's not the way to go, because you want to follow up and say, what would tell us that this is helping? Whether people are whistling at work, whether absenteeism rates go down, whether the quality of, customer feedback, is better. I mean, I don't, not just lines of code, but I mean, how, other kind of things that would say to us, we're doing the kind of work that we're all proud of here. And how can we continually evolve and adapt to whatever is happening in the world around us, to keep that going. I think the in the large corporations that you're talking about, it's easier to think of it as a one size fits all. But I've often found that the one size doesn't always fit all, really. And to look, and also to look for a magic, it's like a magic bullet, silver bullet, kind of thing. Oh my gosh, if we just did this, everything will be fine. And it usually doesn't work that way. And the kind of environments that people work in more specifically will have, like I was saying with the hospital, with, different specialties, there may be different issues in terms of what's causing the burnout. And you want to address those in some way that will actually make a difference for people. And check in with them. Is it working? Do we need to course correct? We thought this would be the great solution, but now we find we have some other issues. How can we do that? And when people see that people are trying to make it better, that they have a role in making it better, they're on board in the same page, that we can commit to doing this and make it happen rather than do a shadow system because we think this new thing sucks and we have to keep doing it the old way, and that it's a regular kind of thing, the kind of message that is coming across, I think can build some optimism and hope. Like if we could fix X, hey, how about Y, that thing that always gets to us? If we could do this, we could do that. And that's why a lot of the examples that I mentioned in the book are things that were done under the radar, not with the top CEO or anything like that. But it's, our team, our unit, we're going to, figure out how we're going to, we know what we need to accomplish, but let's try it this way, and having some success. I mean, I think there's a role for leaders at the top or in special positions, although I worry about some of those positions. Recently, there was a lot of talk about purpose and meaning, which is what we talk about in the values area. Having purpose, meaning, you're proud of what you're doing, et cetera. And then I was hearing that there were a number of organizations who were hiring, like a VP in charge of purpose, and who gets great salary, separate office, all these kind of perks. And everybody's saying, excuse me, that's the solution, is you add another leader at the top and not put the money toward the people who are doing the work and the conditions, so it can backfire because the solution is that another leader will somehow make magic happen. And, if you're really concerned about the quality of your employees and how well they're able to do the things that you would like them to do, you've got to invest in them and their workplaces, not simply get somebody in charge of doing something for them or with them or to them, but if you have a person who is charged with those kind of responsibilities, then they need to be able to convey the message, not just top down, but bottom up to the top CEO about why it matters, why we need to do these things, in order, deal with some of the causes of the problem, and not simply trying to put a Band-Aid on people and as a solution to it. That we do have a responsibility for the work environment. That's what we have, So
Yeah.
Does that help?
Yeah, that does. And one of the things that kind of goes throughout your work that I really appreciate is a real like social psychology and just psychology lens. And this acknowledgement that, like, as a species, we evolved, whatever Dunbar's number is, 150 people, like we evolved in small groups where social relationships were just so essential to our survival.
Absolutely.
And I think sometimes in the context of the workplace, we can forget that that's such a key source of motivation and impact and meaning that we have in groups. And what I really love about your work is it's all around the relationships, like the relationship between the manager and the employees, between the company and the employees, and particularly the piece you just highlighted now, that it's at a small scale. It's not at the 100,000 person scale. It's at the scale of maybe a 20 person team that the kind of the details are being sorted out.
Yeah, because that's the daily environment they're working in, and so people worry that if we customize too much, then it's not saying something about the company as a whole. But if you can articulate what are the goals of the company as a whole and how do each of us have a part to play, it may be quite different, the people here, the part they play, than the people over here. But it ought to be clear how what I do, actually contributes to that larger goal. And in that regard, that's why in the book I included that piece about taking a man to the moon, the whole thing, which was having everybody who was a part of that large program, of figuring out how to build the rocket ships and transport people and were able to articulate it in a way that everybody who did a job in one of these companies that was working on this knew why we're doing this. Our goal is to put somebody on the moon. This is the kind of piece that I'm playing in developing this kind of technology over here. But it was even to the point and I remember seeing this as when I was much younger, obviously, but on television, it was even down, they did it in a way so well that even somebody who was doing a job, who was a janitor, cleaning up, the workspace at the end, when asked kind of, about what you're doing, and said, we're putting him, helping to put a man on the moon, kind of knew that his role was important in creating an environment where people could do the technical work that was going to help Yeah. And so you have a part, you have a role to play. And you take pride in that rather than saying, well, no, I'm not the astronaut and I'm not the person who's designing the rocket ship.
Yeah.
But we are doing this kind of thing, and here's why my part is valuable too.
I think that's a good place for us to leave it. Thank you so much for your time with us today.
Okay.
For people who are looking to find your work, can you just tell us a little bit about how they can find your books, your website, how they can find you?
Yeah. The book is The Burnout Challenge. And it should be in bookstores, obviously. But you can always go to Amazon.com. You can go to the website of Harvard University Press, which published the book, or order, see reviews and things like that. So it's gotten, quite a good response in a lot of places. And so it goes into much more detail about the issues that I discussed with you today, and has examples and things. So if you want to know more about what we were covering, it hopefully is all in there, for it. And it does talk about not just the 6 areas, but how do you begin to make changes using those kind of principles as guidelines. So it's a first step in helping people to actually put to work, some of the things that we've learned about. And hopefully, I think, it's been written in a way that is not loaded down with scientific jargon and stuff, but is, a common language that should be as well understood by managers and CEOs as well as employees. And, so hopefully there's a common model kind of thing of understanding what is causing this kind of stress reaction of burnout, that we can be on the same page when we talk about it. And it's not just employees, on the front lines who have burnout, as you mentioned before, managers often, and it can happen, at all levels. So it ought to be, we're hoping that it will help people come up with ways in which they can work more collaboratively towards shared goal and a shared, environmental conditions that support who we are and why we're there and what we're doing, and us feeling good about what we do.